right, we're going to pick up the conversation that we had yesterday with Ethan Peck. Today with Stefan Padfield. He's the Deputy Director at the National Center's Free Enterprise Project, which is the original and premier opponent of the woke takeover in American corporate life. Stefan, welcome to State of the Nation. We're really glad you're able to join us today. We had a really interesting conversation with Ethan yesterday, and we would like to get your take on it as what you guys are doing. You know, you're basically become shareholders and then denounce DEI, decarb, disarmament, and you're talking to with companies like Amex, Intel, GE, Ford, Duke Energy. I mean, these companies have a huge fiduciary duty to their shareholders. So tell us a little bit about where this is all headed from your perspective.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. And yeah, we've got a lot going on. We're in the middle of shareholder or annual meeting season, basically. And so we, as shareholders, the National Center is a shareholder in these companies that we file proposals with. And we have a variety of proposals that are getting at the issues that you've sort of teed up. And we can just start going down the list, right? So I've got the list in front of me right now. We've got American Express. There's an issue there with merchant category codes. And specifically as to whether or not banks should be tracking firearm purchases. This is something that the left has been trying to get banks to do more of. And so we've got a proposal there to ask the American Express to basically examine whether that's in their best interest, whether that's in the shareholders' best interest or not. It's a very interesting issue because they've got some regulations that they're responding to specifically out of California. And we can talk about that in some more detail. As we go down the list, we had Intel just today. And what we've done there is we've basically reverse engineered some of the sustainability proposals that came from the left dealing with the environment. And what we've done is ask these corporations to look into whether they are financially sustainable given the partnerships that they're entering into, right? With sort of the human rights campaign and some of the LGBTQ trans issues and so on. And then we've got going on from there, as you mentioned, the decarbonization commitments, right? Greenhouse gases. Again, asking these companies, because what we see is, and I think you probably see this as well, they seem to be all into the leftist messaging, but then there's really obvious questions as in, what about the costs? What about if you're wrong? What about if we can't just transition to green energy in a year, right? And so we ask them to take a look at the risks involved in these commitments, ask them to look at the underlying assumptions that they're basing their commitments on. And we've got a couple of proposals there in slightly different forms. We've got a DEI proposal, and this is all just this week, right? So we've got a DEI proposal at Progressive, again, asking them to look at their commitments around DEI and specifically diversity, and whether those are likely to create risks of them being sued for what is often referred to as reverse discrimination, but is just basically discrimination. And then finally, we've got at Ford a proposal asking them to look at whether or not child labor is implicated in their electric vehicle supply chain. Again, another situation where if you just listen to the left, it's all great. What could possibly go wrong? And we're really trying to flag the potential issues and risks for these companies and for the shareholders.
I love how you're attacking them on many fronts, on many different issues, keeping them off balance. That's exactly the right strategy. It's what they try to do with us. It's a very Soviet style monolith that we're fighting, right? I don't use cable TV. I use Roku, but still I can't see a single advertisement for a non-electric car. Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Volvo, Jaguar just announced that this year's Sport Coupe is going to be the last internal combustion engine Sport Coupe that they're going to manufacture. Companies are being forced by governments to going into this, and yet we're seeing the epic failure of electric vehicle technology. The ports in Europe are flooded with cars from China, EVs from China that can't be sold. And so the people to whom the dealerships to whom they've been shipped are just abandoning them at the ports, and the ports are getting clogged with these vehicles. Hertz has announced massive losses at its shareholder meeting this year. In fact, they increased to 50% the write-off, and the loss per share tripled based on their purchase of 60,000 EVs. They're now going to be selling 30,000 of them. The technology doesn't work. It's not suitable for any but short trips. And the vehicles are nothing more than glorified toys that turn into beautiful paperweights after a few years, because the batteries cost $36,000 to replace, and the battery life on them is abysmal. So you're doing a great job. And ultimately, I think all of this, all the DEI, all the EV push, everything else that's coming from the top down is going to collapse under its own weight with the help of people like the center pulling the pins on this massive game of Jenga that we're involved in.
Well, thanks so much. And I think it's just another example that all the things that you just highlighted, where you have, this sort of utopian central planning being crushed by reality, right? Sooner or later, reality always wins. The only question is, how much damage are these radical leftists going to do along the way until reality catches up with them? The market demand is simply not there for these electric vehicles, for these green initiatives. The technology isn't there. And I think what's most frustrating, well, there's a lot of things that are frustrating, but one of them is, to the extent there are real concerns about climate change and needs for solutions, if you just left the market alone, that would be the best way to find the best solutions. But what's happening now is you're having this centralized private-public partnerships. None of these businesses would have gone all in like this without all the push from the governments, right? I think Toyota maybe is one of the only major brands that was willing to see the reality and say, no, we're not going all in. We'll stick with the hybrid. And they've been very successful as a result of that. But the distortion is just causing so much pain. And meanwhile, where the money in the market could have been finding actual solutions, that's blocked off because everybody has to get all in on these, massive. I mean, you cannot ignore the subsidies. So it is understandable to some extent, but very unfortunate.
Yeah, it really is. Stefan, can you expand on the Amex proposal? I'm very curious about this. A lot of Americans do not like, they realize what these Amex tracking and category codes are. It's a subversive, illegal, many would argue, unconstitutional way to build a database of Americans and their firearm purchases and activities being run through, an international banking cartel, basically. How's California pushing this?
Yeah, so basically, just to step back a bit, you've got the merchant category codes. They're already in place. I mean, one of the, I think, maybe easiest examples is just if you get your credit card account for the end of the year, it might break down in terms of spending categories, and a lot of people find that helpful. And a lot of that's probably driven by these merchant category codes. So they're already out there, but the push to have them target specifically gun purchases or firearm sellers is one that has been a battleground, right? So the banks were basically responding to some leftist pressure. How this cycle goes. There's some horrible shooting, and then all of a sudden everybody thinks the solution is to ban guns and to infringe our Second Amendment rights rather than just go after the criminals that are harming people. And so there's a push for that, and the banks were responding, but then they got so much backlash that they backed off. Now we have California a few years later basically requiring these codes, these merchant category codes associated with gun purchases. And where we come into the picture is we want Amex to be very clear about, okay, we understand if California is requiring this, that's an issue that you have to respond to. But what we don't want and what we won't accept and what your shareholders and the customers won't accept is to use that as an excuse to start tracking everybody's gun purchases, right? There are other ways to deal with California. Unfortunately, that Supreme Court opinion, I think, came down in a way that was, certainly difficult to overcome, where they basically ruled that California can set its rules, and then if that makes the entire rest of the country have to bend the knee to California, so be it. We'll let the market respond. I think there's probably some other solutions, but fine, you have to respond to California, you have to follow their rules, but don't use that as an excuse to start tracking everybody's purchases across the field. And I think they're on notice that they can't just sort of do that and then act as if, oh, well, we just tried to keep things simple. I don't think anybody's going to accept that.
Yeah, and this is just another attempt at doing what they did here in New York State. They called it Operation Choke Point. Any businesses that the powers that be did not approve were subjected to this, and it was attacking gun shows, adult products, tobacco stores, cigar shops, porn shops, etc. Attacking them through the banking. They're attacking ammunition. So that's why George Washington said the Second Amendment contemplated not only the muskets, but also sufficient shot and powder, because ammunition is essential to the Second Amendment. And so the courts here, even in New York State, said, no, this is not permissible. You cannot deny banking facilities to legal businesses just because you don't care for them. But they're back at it again. This is all just Operation Choke Point on steroids.
I think that's right. And there's this thing that James Lindsay talks about, which is the iron law of woke projection, right? When they're accusing you as leftists of something, it's probably because they're doing it. And so they talk so much about, threats to democracy, threats to democracy. Well, these are issues that should be being handled in our legislatures. And instead, they just try to use their power over these corporations to do it indirectly. They're essentially subverting the democratic process precisely in areas where we should be having these conversations with our lawmakers. And instead, they're just running right to these corporations and try to do it, behind our backs, essentially. And so, fortunately, there's enough people that are paying attention, and we're proud to be part of that process to basically stand up and say, no, that's unacceptable, make sure people are aware of it. And even if these proposals that we put on, we go into it, we want to win every one. But what's important about the process is, even if we don't get a win, or even if we don't get a ton of votes, because we're up against essentially all the proxy advisors and all the asset managers, right, that are on the other side, the fact that we have these conversations, that we are able to bring this into the public space, we're able to get the filings, right, get on shows like this and have the conversations with you, but also with the management. I was just at the Berkshire Hathaway meeting. There's an entire basically NBA arena, and you get to stand there and make your pitch, and it's full of shareholders from all over the world. And so even if the proposal doesn't win, you're getting that message out there, and you're able to alert people to what's going on.
That must be pretty exciting. That must be a good feeling when you're up there speaking to a panel of people like that. Even if you know that you're up against sort of an immovable force, it starts to not feel quite as immovable, I bet, when you see the lights go on, the light bulb go off over someone's head, someone sitting there who's highly invested in one of these companies going, maybe they're right.
Well, and it is one of those things where if you just are head down day to day, it can almost get a little depressing. But you take a look what's happened over the last year or two, right? I mean, we've seen the rhetoric get completely turned around. People are essentially, some very big actors like Larry Fink at BlackRock, essentially worried about using ESG, right? I think it was like in 3 shareholder letters ago, it was, sort of 14 times, and now it's not at all. And yeah, that may be just symbolic, but I think it is meaningful, right? There's still a lot to be fought, right? With DEI, they're now going away from DEI and towards inclusivity, right? Some of that is just shell game branding, but there is also something substantive going on, because if they didn't realize that the market and the shareholders and the citizens don't like this stuff, they wouldn't be changing the names, right? And now our job is to keep on top of them and keep highlighting what they're doing. But that sort of change over the course of 2 years, 3 years, that really makes it worthwhile, because we're certainly not alone enforcing that, but we know we're a part of that process. So even when these proposals, are not necessarily winning, the fact that we keep bringing them and we keep having these conversations is part of what has led us to the point where now these companies, a lot of them are afraid of using the term ESG.
Yeah, well, they should be, because that this is also part of it's a double-edged sword, because the media and the politicians and woke culture warriors, they're the ones that weaponized all this stuff, and they're the ones that took it and made it political. So yeah, maybe common sense people and conservatives were a little bit late to the game in figuring out how to fight it, but do you think they shot themselves in the foot by making it so political that now it's a common dinner table and bar top talking point?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That used to be one of their mottos, right? The private is political, and now it's sort of the hens are coming home to roost, or whatever that saying is. But when I think about how we got here, it's never just one type of individual or one group, right? I'm very fond of talking about the fact that you've got the true believers, the opportunists, the useful idiots, and the cowards, right? And it really takes all of them to get us to the point where we're having all these problems. But if you flip that around, if you can get even one of them to start altering the way they work, then you start making some serious headway. So, for example, the cowards are realizing that they actually can speak up, right? When we speak up at these meetings, when you all put on your shows, right? There's countless people who have, over the last few years, I mean, just remember, it wasn't that long ago where if somebody called you a racist, 90% of people on the right would just go scurrying because that was the worst thing ever. And now we know they're always going to call you a racist. It doesn't matter what you say. So fine, call me a racist and then we'll continue the conversation. So the courage is starting to come in. And so even if that's the only group that we're affecting, right? And I think we're also affecting the opportunists because we're making it more costly, right? It used to be the case that these folks could just say, well, we'll just pander to the left because they're the only ones that are going to throw hysterics and boycott, right? Well, we saw this past summer with Target and Bud Light and Disney, that game's no longer playing. So it's become more costly for the opportunists. The cowards are waking up and finding some courage. And hopefully by continuing to push this message, the useful idiots are starting to see, oh, hey, you know what? For example, when you defund the police, crime goes up. When you don't put people in jail, they continue to commit more crime, right? So some of that is changing. The true believers are probably going to be the true believers till the end. But if we can change the other folks that are a part of the problem, then we can make some real headway.
Absolutely. That cause and effect, that FAFO factor again, Timothy.
Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right, Stefan. In fact, that's a large part of what Brian and I do here is maybe we're preaching to the choir, but oftentimes what we're doing is giving people courage. We're encouraging them, literally instilling courage in them to let them know that they're not crazy, they're not alone, and that they too can speak out and make a difference. And that's exactly what you folks are doing with this effort.
Thanks so much. And you hear this all the time about the sort of two approaches. So one is to try to change people's minds, and the other is to get the people who already agree with you to stand up and do more, right? And both things are important. And what you guys are doing and what we're doing is at the very least firing up the people who already agree with us so they'll do more, give more, be more courageous. And that's excellent.
All right. That's what we're all about, Stefan. And thank you so much. Nationalcenter.org to keep up with Stefan, Ethan, and all their great colleagues over there doing amazing work, helping us light that fuse for freedom as we do here at Today's News Talk. Thank you so much, Stefan. Very much appreciate your work. And we'll look forward to having you back on again for an update real soon. On